Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Happy Easter Sunday for those of you who are celebrating Easter. It's Passover weekend, and just welcome to everyone from what I understand is an international gathering. My name is Rob Fields. I am the President and Executive Director at Weeksville Heritage Center in Brooklyn, and thrilled to be here with this great panel for today's discussion. As you all know, this is, I think, the third in the ADAMA Art Salon series. Quite honored to be here. And thought we should take a few minutes and let the panelists introduce themselves before we get into the conversation. So you all who are watching can have a little context and understanding about where the panelists are coming from, what their various practices and work involves, and then we'll get into a discussion. Yeah, let's get started. Chris, you want to start? Just introduce yourself and what Alice Yard is.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'm an artist. I live in Trinidad in the Caribbean. I co-founded Alice Yard with two colleagues, Nicholas Lachlan, and who's a writer-editor, and Sean Leonard, who's an architect, who is really the sort of engine of Alice Yard, because being an architect, he's very interested in how one articulates and uses space. And we've had many collaborations over the years, and most recently, Chen, a designer, has joined us in that conversation more directly than others because we have a wider circle. And he's very interested in, he had a thing called tooth prints, and he's also interested in rhizo printing, which is a rising trend. So, and along with that, he's also been involved in the stick walking, what they call moko jumbies. So a whole conversation has started around that. What else can I, this is just the introduction, so I don't start talking about what we're doing. That's what we do. It's it's a conversation and that we have here in Port of Spain with links out into the region and the diaspora and internationally.
Awesome. Thank you and welcome. AJ, I'm just going across from left to right or right to left. I don't know what to. AJ, you're next up.
All right. Good morning from wherever. I'm AJ Girard. I'm actually, I oversee community relations at the Underground Museum in Los Angeles, California. Even more specific, it's the West Adams, Arlington Heights area of Los Angeles, California. I've been in this role for about a year. Professionally, I've probably been in the museum field for about 5 years, and then the arts for about, my whole life, but I would always start to say at 15. I went to an arts high school in Dallas, and then I left there, went to Howard for art history, and that landed me in the city, this role, this position. I work for a museum that has a really, really wonderful, unique story. So purple is the color behind me. Purple is the color, the theme color here. So I work for the family of Noah Davis. Noah Davis was an artist who was actually from Seattle, who came to this neighborhood with a huge mission in mind. He wanted to create a space that was as much as it is. And I'm actually gonna maybe move into a share screen real quick so you guys can get a little visual. This is the, let's see, are we in it?
Yes, you're starting.
Okay. Let's see, I only have 3 images, but some of these stills are some of my favorite stills that I could just grab up really quickly of, this is my favorite, of the Purple Garden. This is, so entirely, it's a museum space that is so many different things at once. Noah and his wife, Karan, a sculptor, moved into this space. The museum has been going since 2012. So this is the like sort of the third part of the museum. You would walk into what looks like a regular storefront in the neighborhood that very much blends into the neighborhood. And then you'd walk into a bookstore that centers its voice on artists of color, people of color. Noah Davis's story, if you guys are familiar to the art world, his older brother is Khalil Joseph, who has produced Black News and things like that. You'll be met with a screen that welcomes you into that loop. And then you follow into a gallery space that we've shown artists like last year, Lorna Simpson, Dina Lawson, Roy De Carava, Rodney McMillan as of late. And then we were moving into the retrospective of Noah Davis, our founder, who was a painter. And then the third iteration is the garden, the purple garden, as we call it. So purple was very much key. This is a really beautiful still shot. This is another one. Purple flowers everywhere, a Nipsey Hussle altar in commemoration of him. The sculpture here is by our family, Leanne Barnes. She created that. She keeps the garden moving. And then this is one of my favorite stills, speaking to what I said, the altar, just sort of the life of what the purple garden can be, and all diverse, all unique, all different people from the neighborhood, from the art world, from different sectors of life coming together and celebrating a good time. So I'm gonna move back to me. Is that okay? There I am. So yeah, I've been here in this role and just figuring things out, moving as I can. So good morning.
Good morning. Good morning. So before we go to Sharelly, just wanted to let everyone know that there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen that you can enter questions, and we'll do a combination of save them for the end, but I'll keep monitoring as things come up, and then perhaps try to inject them into the conversation and discussion as we're going along. Also, please try and follow ADAMA _ATL on Instagram. They are doing, that's where you can find them, as well as the ADAMA site. So with that said, Sharelly, please introduce yourself and tell everyone about all the incredible work you're doing.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure. Thank you for the invitation, and everybody, thank you for tuning in. My name is Sharelly Emanuelson. I'm from Curacao, based in Curacao, which many people always have to say that your position is nearby a bit of Venezuela, so people can get an idea of where we are in the Caribbean region. And I'm an artist. I'm a filmmaker. So audiovisual media, audiovisual installation is most of my practice. And I'm the founder of UniArte. UniArte is an arts organization which tries to give a platform for artists and to encourage conversation, encourage dialogue within also the audiences that might be interested in the production and the process of development of artistic practices. So I will also switch to the share screen. Let's see. Can you guys see?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay.
Yes.
So yeah, so UniArte, you can follow us on Instagram as well as Facebook, where we post most of our events. What I will talk about right now is mainly our two last projects. So when I studied in the Netherlands, I started UniArte in the Netherlands out of a necessity of to kind of meet like minds and meet creatives that also are coming from the Caribbean region, feeling a sense that connectivity that could be productive, seeing that having dialogue with other artists with coming from the same context would be a good thing to have. So that's how I initiated it in the Netherlands. And when coming back home, I wanted to continue the journey. And I had seen a lot of different initiatives taking place where empty buildings were being reused. So there's kind of a housing for artists having a house for artists where artists could just be and kind of produce and mingle and just like lay back. I thought it was a great way to kind of get to know ourselves better and kind of encourage development in a more collective, but also cherishing the individual growth. So then when Casa Moderna, which is the first picture, is one of the first buildings that we moved into. So I'm just showing, I have a few slides. This is the way it was. So when there was an old building, old store owned by a family, a Jewish family living in Curacao. And they were very nice to kind of allow us to make use of the space and use of the building. And after we stayed in there for 3 years. So here's a more like a before and after picture. So we cleaned with a lot of volunteers, we cleaned the place up and kind of start holding events, artist talks. So we would have artists, this is Cozier from the States, who has roots back in the Curacao. So we really try to offer a platform where artists could come, could experiment things, but also have a space where they could engage with themselves, with the audience. And piece by piece, we would kind of arrange the environment of the building and kind of clean it up or give it a new look. Here are some of the activities that we would hold in the building. So below is the ground floor would be open for public. We would hold film nights, theater was held, exhibitions were given, and these are all the artists that would initiate the project. So most of the times there are no curators involved, or it's not another organization, but just the artists that would initiate and start the programming. They would have the space to activate. On the top floors, it was a space where artists could have studio spaces. So it was really important for me to kind of see, okay, once we have a space where we could develop, progress, collaborate, what kind of things would emerge, or would that help with the production? So here, some other pictures of eating together, conversing, and also having more artist talk. So even artists from abroad who would come by would have a chance to invite everybody to have talks and engage. And this is the last picture of the recent building, because we just moved. So that's the blue building, that's the second project, where the first one, the difference is that the first one was really in the main street of the city center, a shopping street. Now we moved. So we're still in the city center, but we are more independent in the sense that we pay rent. It's a new location where we're gonna focus more on maybe the development. It's taken a different course. But yeah, as you can see, we had a few events, but because of Corona, right now everything is very still. And we're very excited to have a chance to kind of initiate post-Corona, initiate more activities and engagement with artists. So that is to give you a very short idea of what we did so far, like here.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, and if you guys don't mind, I actually wanted to do a moment and share a few slides about Weeksville, because I never want to assume that everybody knows Weeksville Heritage Center. So I'm going to take everybody through this super quickly, just so you know who we are. Weeksville is an historic house museum in central Brooklyn, in what is the Crown Heights neighborhood of central Brooklyn. It was one of the largest free Black communities in pre-Civil War America. And this is a map of the boundary of historic Weeksville. So fairly broad for those of you who know Brooklyn. And It was funded by a man named James Weeks and a group of Black investors in 1838, and their idea was to create this free intentional community. As we move forward, there are three distinct periods in Weeksville's history. There was the 1930 period, which was growth and the growth of the community, which saw it create its own institutions, things like schools, retirement homes, orphanages. It had a baseball team, a newspaper, 3 churches that still exist. By 1930, it actually sort of disappeared as it was absorbed into a changing Brooklyn. It was rediscovered in 1968 by a group of local activists who saved the last remaining relics from the mid-19th and early 20th century, the 3 Hunterfly Road houses, and that's what we are stewards of. And from 1968 through basically 2013, there was a lot of activity and work centered around the houses to protect them. The houses are landmarked now, both as part of New York City landmarks and nationally. The big leap forward, I think, in 2014 happened when one of my predecessors as executive director worked with the city to get a new building built. And so that opened in 2014, and it's a 23,000 square foot center that has classrooms or offices. It has a big multi-purpose space, and it also has a gallery. So we're able to do a lot of programs there that speak to both the history, the culture, and conversations and activities. And really, this 1.5 acre campus is really a very much a community center. One of the things we have here is a gallery. And so we have, over the last 2.5 years, had some really amazing artists come through. And it's been everyone from Fahamu, who had his show there in October. We had an African art exhibit about a year ago. Artists like Damian Davis, and in the upper left of your screen, you'll see Mindy and Keith, Obadike, Imani Shanklin Roberts, Kamika Patton. We were supposed to have Marcus Jamal's work in at the end of March, but of course, Corona came up. And as you'll see in the upper right, we were supposed to also do Black News with Khalil Joseph and the Brooklyn Academy of Music. So all this stuff has been on hold, but I think, as this new space has given us this opportunity to do visual arts exhibits in a dedicated gallery space, and that's been really great. So, you can find out more information on weeksvillesociety.org, and this is the end of my slideshow right here. And so we're going to get into this conversation about creating alternative spaces and the issues around that. I think that, many of you have seen the description you all have probably seen the description of today's talk. And the question is, what are we talking about when we talk about non-traditional spaces, and non-traditional compared to what? I mean, in our pre-event conversation, Fahamu said that, the purpose of ADAMA, for example, is not to create a Black version of a white museum. So what are these assumptions that we are breaking, questioning, challenging, trying to supplant, and how does that come across in each of your work? It sort of suggests some kinds of different kind of responsibilities, right? And some different challenges. So, AJ, why don't we start with you?
So particularly to the Underground Museum, how we think about that, what is alternative space, which I think obviously for many people means like what is Black or brown or other space, is a huge part of our narrative, really. So our founder, Noah Davis, created this museum in mind, really looking at the structure of museums across the board and saying, like some of the research that I've done that I find to be a brilliant thing is like, you know, the museum structure is so corrupt as it is. There's no real way to fix it from within. We have to go make our own, and we have to do something different. And so that our own thing is something that we go back and forth with. I think Noah worked with Helen, just for the record. Helen is a curator. She was formerly the chief curator at MoCA in California. She's done a lot of work around like artists like Kara James Marshall, Black Mountain College. She's actually a huge part of our story, and she's a white woman. She helped bring in what was essentially like Noah created this will and testament, is how I always frame it, as 18 different art shows that he wanted to see be brought to this neighborhood that I'm in, which is a, you know, historically Black and brown neighborhood. He wanted to bring in this high idea of fine art, which, you know, definitely centers itself on like artists of color, but has also reached past that in a lot of different ways. And we've had like artists like Dan Flavin and Ellsworth Kelly and William Kentridge, all, you know, a part of the larger canon. White artists, white male artists have been seen here. But particularly for this conversation, I think, yeah, we definitely center the diaspora as best as we can. I think it leaves me as a community outreach, you know, with a lot of challenge, because it's like, what does that mean for our people particularly? Like, have we even been brought into that conversation enough to even start to have a strong opinion about it? So that's my beginning point. I think that's like something I can see how other people feel about it too. But
that's great. That's great. That's great. Sharelly?
Well, for me, in terms of what traditional, non-traditional, I think alternative is also something that, as I started, I wanted to create, coming from living in the Caribbean and having to move abroad to go study, and thinking of whether staying, coming back home, would mean thinking about how would I develop, where would my work as an artist go, how would I interact with the audience, and seeing what kind of infrastructure was available at home or was already happening at home, and kind of trying to really be honest with myself how I would want things to be or see things to be differently. And that kind of led me to act myself instead of join an infrastructure that would already exist, but kind of try to experiment something new and see, also tune in with others to see if there were needs as well as my own, that I could kind of organize and continue with. So that led me to kind of create a space where it doesn't focus, for instance, on the island. You have a very pretty cut exhibition in a gallery space presented for tourists or a particular group. I really wanted to open that up and focus more on the process where there is no work or work that had already been made could be presented. So having a space where it's not only about the presentation, but what happens before that. In that, to kind of create a particular experience and knowledge to engage with conversations with the institutions and with infrastructures that were already in place. Right? And also, I think doing it differently, it's like it's an artist run. So that means I create myself. So what would that make difference? What are the responsibilities that I'm overlooking and seeing when it comes to an institution? If I take that responsibility, how would I manage it? You know, that kind of gives me a different position to kind of be in a dialogue. And also, so for me, and taking ownership and kind of making sure that I get the experience hands-on and be able to pass it on colleagues was in my mind a way to kind of be different and kind of inspiring change, because you can be bolder. You are oftentimes more flexible to make shifts, to recommend change or to try things out, as of where an infrastructure that is already fixed or only has been brought of a generation-long family, etc. So yeah, that's kind of what comes for me.
I'm going to come back to a couple things you said, but Chris, please jump in here and talk about your perspective on traditional, alternative, non-traditional. What's your perspective on how that functions, particularly there in Trinidad?
Sure. I just want to apologize to you at the beginning. I thought we were just saying hello. So I didn't get a chance to share my images and talk.
No, please, go ahead, do that. That's fine.
I do it later or something.
Okay.
But I think this question of traditional or alternative and so on is kind of ironic in our context, because I think in the Caribbean, what distinguishes us is the things that we do in the spaces between spaces. And as the name of Aliciad implies, we started out in a backyard, and the backyard is not necessarily an alternative to some formal institution, because we don't have formal institutions, especially around the visual. I mean, we have some leftover kind of colonial spaces that we call museums for, insects, birds, and maybe some national art and so on. I'm talking about Trinidad specifically. So around the kind of work that we support and the kind of experiments that we have engaged in, it's actually that we're returning to a tradition of people working in backyards because where Aliciad started was in Woodbrook, a sort of a community that was developed in the 30s, a suburb of the city, where people's backyards were initiatives for carnival production, for theatrical troupes, for different kinds of things. So the yard is kind of part of the DNA. It's like a trope. So it's not so much an alternative, it's that we're returning to a tradition that's been neglected. Yeah.
I think that's important to, frame the conversation of tradition and alternative in context, and give people a broader understanding of what that can mean in various contexts, because so often this conversation is very North American, European centric. And, one of the incredible things about these conversations, this salon, is that we are getting perspectives from the Caribbean, outside the United States, and and traditions that are based on a whole different set of protocols and customs and, and history. And that, I think, is liberating in a lot of ways for Black people, just to know that there are, and be reminded that there are other ways to do things. Sharelly, one of the things you were talking about was it's not just about the presentation, but process. I think that's a key thing here, because so many times white people like to think that Black people are just inspired and they just do stuff. And there's never really this focus on process, and learning process and whatnot. And so I think that, it'd be great to, I think you and Chris are very much in conversation around this whole, context being so important for the work you're doing, both Chris as helping artists, but you being particularly focused on artist development, and being an artist presenter, space runner of space, that kind of thing. So are there similarities that you see and opportunities that we're not seeing? Both of you can jump in on this, actually, in terms of the opportunities to develop this kind of infrastructure, particularly in the Caribbean, because there are some similarities in terms of lack of infrastructures and things like that. Also seems like there's a lot of opportunities there, is what I'm saying.
I think I think, I mean, to take on the position of like helping artists. I mean, I'm an artist myself, right? So whatever I'm doing came out of a necessity that for me myself as a practitioner, was found necessary for my own development, and I was seeing colleagues also needing certain things. So it was more of organizing in a particular with tools that have been taught, you know, from elsewhere, and kind of use these tools to kind of understand what it is I'm doing, you know, and what am I interested? How can I develop, construct my work? How can I dialogue? How can I converse with the audience, and creating that space where that is available? And so as I am doing that, and I created like a house where more artists could also jump on the wagon, so to speak, you know, and kind of be part of that. And why process? Because oftentimes we are diverted into what we make, because our education, this is the context for the Dutch Caribbean, or at least in Curacao, and I believe in Aruba, I can speak for as well, is that the education system and how we are taught in terms of history of our own is very limited, and is very Eurocentric, you know. And so the moment that even in the production, whatever you have been taught or remains, the moment that you go abroad, it's brainwashed, or it's just, you know, you lose a lot. So for me, it was a space to kind of rethink, you know, in terms of process, and kind of this own thinking that has been done in the past, kind of investigate what has been done, what is applicable to me, or what each individual can be interested in. So in that line of thought, that's the more focus than just presenting as opposed to showing a particular skill, but just in thinking about the work we made, where does it come from, who are we mimicking, really, you know, and what is ours or what isn't, and yeah, those type of things I found much more valuable. And what I think is important is that the production, me myself, it's a struggle when let's say you don't, when there's no infrastructure, right? Because then you're very much easily distracted to go make commercial work, or so it's how do you manage with the resources that you have to kind of keep focus. I don't know if I answered your question of it.
Yeah. Chris, you go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, when I left, I studied in the US in the 80s, and it was a different time. And yes, it was a time that was very hegemonic. And when I kind of almost threw my hands up in the air and left, you know, and of course in that era, before the internet and before the kind of connectivity that has manifested itself over the last, say, 10 or 20 years, but I also felt that so much of the conversation was about exclusion and inclusion. And one of the things that motivated me to do a lot of the work that I've done back in the Caribbean, and specifically with Aliciad, the conversations we've had, is that you can't really be left out of a narrative of your own making. So the big challenge that people have in the Caribbean is what are we about? You know, what are we doing? And because in this new era, one of the other challenges that we are faced with is that we are kind of coerced into opening spaces, but they become entrepreneurial more than critical, where success is defined by who gets the grant or who gets the connection. But they float over and above, and maybe sometimes even separately from the questions at hand on the floor, respective communities or islands. So one of the challenges that Aliciad has faced is people ask us, so why do we exist? Or what's your plan? Is this a device for laundering? Consider our proximity to the continent. Or are we involved in something else. And I think what interests me is context building and community building and dialogue building. So like Sharelly, I was fascinated by her images. I saw these rooms, with notice boards and chairs and people assembling. Because yes, I mean, part of the work of living in contexts like this is sort of making space. When we were talking yesterday, I talked very informally about sort of like, when I moved to the US and hip hop was coming and kids would drop linoleum on the street and a boombox and linoleum would create a platform. And it was very similar to my own experience growing up in the Caribbean, where we would have block parties and you'd make a circle. And the circle is the space that protected your crew. And the more dynamic member of your crew had with the most dynamic moves would jump into that circle. But the circle wasn't exclusive. What defined the right to go in the circle on one level was dexterity and skill. But on another level, we were trying to make space. So there was a kind of way in which you would say, okay, even though we know you are not, can't do 10 backflips or something, but we want everybody to jump in. So you kind of had a combination of the people that were extremely dexterous or skilled and those who had other skills. But everybody got to participate. And that sort of in the round inclusion opened all kinds of ideas that we'd never thought of. And so, when we first imagined Alice Yard, we were thinking about our immediate location of Port of Spain. But as has become evident over the years, many initiatives similar to Alice Yard have manifested. Alice Yard was founded in 2006 in the Anglophone Caribbean and some degree in the Dutch Caribbean. I think Atelier's 89 was one of the first attempts, which was Elvis Lopez in Aruba. When I first came back from the US, I encountered Elvis imagining that. I think there was something called Pop-Up that started in Nassau. We started another organization in Port of Spain back in the late 90s that didn't last. And now there's Fresh Milk, there's, I'm forgetting the name of the one in Kingston. And so there are different initiatives. And what's really been defining the Caribbean in the last maybe 10 years is the amount of artist-run initiatives. Each one taking on the challenge based on the requirements of their own particular environment. But I think what's very interesting is the tension between these, not the tension as in an argument, but the sort of relation between these spaces and the traditional, the other traditional, I should say, desire for institutional spaces. So when I first returned to the Caribbean in the late 80s, early 90s, every country was dreaming to have a national gallery of art or some contemporary space. And I used to call it the complex, because everybody would talk about needing money to build some big edifice. And now the conversation has shifted completely to all of these small initiatives where people are creating mechanisms to support analytical work within their respective locations, but also how to make links with fellow organizations. In fact, I was just in Puerto Rico, myself and my other colleagues meeting with Beta Local. And then the Corona thing sort of hit and we all had to scramble back to our respective locations. But it's all about context building in your own community and then in the wider Caribbean community. And hopefully as we grow and we evolve into the sort of wider diaspora, an international, because that's kind of how it has always been, whether it is in the early nascent periods of anti-colonial or Pan-African conversations, which were global from the onset.
I think one of the things that both of you are bringing up is, one of the distinctions of Black spaces. And that is that we have a community first sort of aspect that are mainstream and more Eurocentric institutions think of later. It's like, oh, we need to do outreach to, you know, all these other communities. It's like, we don't exist without our people. You know, if our people aren't coming, you know, then it's kind of like, what are we doing here? And I think we're all very clear about that. And so this sort of need to, on one hand, develop spaces for process and for, you know, supporting artists and creating context is also balanced on the need to, or by the need to walk amongst the people. You know, we got to, you know, as a friend of mine says, we have to be doing the people's work, you know, as we create these spaces, because our communities have different needs. AJ, I see you nodding here.
I've been bursting. Just the inner trickster inside of me is beginning really emotional listening to both of them talk, all of this conversation, because Corona's definitely taken its toll on the human contact element for me.
Mm-hmm.
So this work has drawn me in my entire life. So I feel like I'm seeing myself over 2 times right now, which is really exciting, because I was like beaming with excitement. Then I started to get very serious, because I'm like, okay, well then it only brings up the pitfalls of the work. And so listening to what he was saying about just even the location specific, like this idea that he has a garden, and I was beaming looking at pictures from your organization where you guys do yoga in your backyard space. And that's very similar for the underground, how we host yoga weekly there. We do movie nights weekly there. We open up space for some young people from Howard who do a supermarket where they give a chance for the neighborhood to buy local produce, where we do talks and panels and holding court, and where many visitors have cried to me just in this idea of like, what is safe space? What is happy space?
Right.
As I always bring up, and I brought up yesterday, and I would just want to repeat for the people today, is like, people hear the Underground Museum and they immediately think Harriet Tubman, we are a railroad station. and I know that it has like a light heart to it, but at the same time, it's like the why is that necessary? Why is it still necessary to think about safe space and what that role for me can be? And I mean, yeah, this conversation, this idea of building our own feels so loaded in a lot of different ways, because as beautiful as it sounds, it's still a prevalent, why is that needed?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that for the idea for like the larger, whatever institutions, whatever we mean with that, them to still ignore that work and to not put it into context is I think why we are,
Mm-hmm.
why it's still that, you know, why our artists still feel like coming into Black-owned spaces isn't a credential-worthy conversation, or why audiences aren't necessarily drawn to some of these conversations, because it still feels, I mean, why do we even bring up the word colonial? It still comes back to that very old, ancient way of separating. And that's, yeah.
Right. And I mean, I think there's a lot to this idea. And by the way, AJ, we're going to go back to you and try and do your slides again, because apparently some people said they didn't advance. So we're going to come back so we can see
technology,
the images. Yeah. We're going to come back, because I think it'd be good if folks could see that. So, you know, we'll try that again.
I just forgot it. I thought I was just saying hello, and then we'll come back to that. And then, but
we're going to. I definitely want to give us time for you guys
track now, so maybe.
Yeah. Well, we're going to blame Sharelly here, because she like jumped into her PowerPoint and everything first. So. No, but I do think that there is this piece of it that is about this idea of safe space is super duper important. A place where Black experience is centered, a place where, you know, you can be unapologetically Black and celebrate. You know, I like to say, you know, Weeksville, and I'm sure this is for all your places too, is a place where yes, you center Black history and Black creativity and Black culture, but it's a place just to celebrate how dope it is to be Black. Mm-hmm. You know, and unapologetically so. You know, and there are few and far, you know, places in, you know, the Western world where you can do that. And so all of these spaces that you all are creating, you know, provide this kind of needed respite for people to come in and just be like, oh, that's me on the wall. That's, I'm being, spoken to and acknowledged in a way that acknowledges who I am, and I'm seen as a person. And that kind of thing is important, even as we are celebrating artists and creators who are, at whatever stage of their career, but they're trying to focus on, creating out of their Black experiences, whether they're Black American or they're, Afro-Caribbean or Afro-European or whatever. They're trying to, sort of create out of that. And that safe space is like super duper important in a world that runs on anti-Blackness. So
can I say, I think that's why I felt it was really intentional to come and sit in front of the purple wall, because even on my tours, when I'm talking to guests who haven't always had context around art history, we are very different in the way that we show artists of color on colored walls as often as we can, because even what does that mean to be in white gallery space, white, what is all of that intention immediately at the door that you might not even pick up are the cues that you are not extremely centered. Because people often ask that argument like, well, what is a Black museum and why the need? I mean, every museum's not going to say contemporary museum of white male artists, but damn near, right? And so it's even in the introduction. That's why I was really kind of holding to this idea of that through line of us all having garden spaces. Historically, like, were we able to gather in groups larger than whatever? And I still think to that day, like, people, especially my elders, they get very emotional just seeing young people smiling and dancing and celebrating and running and the joy, because how often had they not been able to have that? And even today for me, like, it was intentional to invite as many friends, my peers as possible into this conversation, because I don't always have access to the wider conversation either. Like, I think people always miss that up with the diaspora. Like, it's the similar experience spread out. It's not that we're all very different. I actually think it's all very similar. It's just that we've all been dislocated from each other, disconnected, and that is the work,
Right.
I like this.
I think what I wanted to add what I wanted to add is it's very interesting for me to like hear, and this is great. And what it makes me think of is also the need, like the Caribbean context is again a different one, right? So while the reality of the United States is very, the Black space that needs to be enhanced.
100%.
The reality is like the way we interact and the how the community, how broad and mixed our communities are in the Caribbean, kind of asks for different dialogue. Because there's more face-to-face, there's more interaction, there's more mixture. So you never in that very drastic homogenetic spaces, and so it's a very different, that's why in my own way, I wanted to create a different space where it's not really, because I'm not, I'm a mix as well. And so like, what type of space would I actually be unapologetically who I am? And when, so I think for all of us, it's really kind of interesting to see how one needs a space to just be, wherever you are, right?
Right.
And as soon as that is not being, when you're not being let in, instead of kind of having to fit into other people's requirements, so to speak, kind of see what comes out of your own. And that gives you, or at least for me, I found it to be a more interesting conversation where you kind of more equal conversations can be held from that position. From having that ownership of your actions.
It's empowering.
Yeah, that was the point actually that was striking me as I heard you all talking. So Sharelly kind of started the ball rolling, because in a sense, in the space that I grew up in, as a majority, whiteness isn't necessarily it's not an ethnic thing. It's really a kind of a way of understanding oneself in relation to entitlement and capital. you know, from a long history of colonial machineries. So small places like the Caribbean, when you talk about safe spaces and sanctuaries, I think that is what the Black experience has created in the Caribbean, which is, you know, we're small, we're not gonna bomb, blow up, or invade anywhere, but we could sort of create spaces where a broad cross-section of displaced people, displaced for different reasons, whether it's, you know, Trinidad has a large population from Asia, as is most of the Southern Caribbean, Suriname, Guyana, and so on. The problem of sexuality, the problems around gender. So, I mean, the Caribbean is the kind of place where these things can be imagined or reimagined, because we are leaving that colonial past behind. I mean, this is very important at a time, say, for example, where because of the virus, we're being called upon to social distancing. There's lockdowns in all our countries, and people are beginning to speculate, you know, this is an opportunity for the forces that have spent hundreds of years trying to regulate our bodies and regulate our interactions. You know, so the right of assembly, the declaration of self in public space are things that suddenly we have all complied because, of course, out of good sense, but we can only speculate about what an opportunity that is for the colonial forces, who still see our bodies and our presence as something that they can rationalize themselves through regulating, obscuring, or negating. You know, so this is a very interesting moment for us. And so I think that in the Caribbean, you can talk about white and Black, but not necessarily in terms of an ethnography, because we've had Black government and governance now for 60, 70 years, some country, you know, but what about the engines that we've inherited, the templates we've inherited from the colonial realm? And then what happens when we interact with societies where those hegemonies are still intact? How they choose to interact with us, who they empower and who they don't, who they see and who they don't, as you know, active collaborators to perpetuate or to, you know. That's why I went back to the beginning where I talked about how you can't be left out of a narrative of your own making, but you could also, you know,
That's the quote of the day.
That is the.
And under what conditions, right?
Yeah, exactly. So real interesting stuff happening in the chat here. I think this whole idea of different context and not looking at things white and Black. Otto Ribeiro says, so much changes with one flight. Yeah, you know, I think that's it. You know, there's a lot of great conversation happening in the chat. I think one of the things I think we wanted to also touch on was just this idea of, if we agree that there is, the idea of safe spaces has various meanings, how do we hold that space? You know, and how do we, you know, and Chris, well, this is one of the ideas you touched on yesterday and again today with the, you know, the circle being the space, this idea of, you know, for our institutions, and I guess this is a context thing, you know, this idea of fluidity versus solidity, and like, what does sustainability really look like for institutions? You know, in the United States, we have one idea about, you know, how do we keep, you know, holding space and all that. But, you know, we've had this idea of, you know, if in the case for you guys, you moved from your original space, and you said the dialogue had to change because the space and the context were changing. So yeah, what does sustainability look like, you know, particularly in a, you know, sort of non-US, sort of more global context where, there are different sets of parameters. And, I think it's important for those of us based here in the United States to kind of hear from you guys what that looks like and means and could mean, because it may give us some ideas around how to, better navigate or navigate in some different ways. There's some different tools on navigating. So I'd throw that to you and Sharelly. What is this idea of sustainability, or this idea of fluidity versus solidity? And Chris, maybe you can start by explaining that a little bit more, and then Sharelly jump in. Sorry, Chris.
I mean, it's funny, because Gabby and Kobo, and they were here recently visiting us at Alice Yard. And one of the things I did with them is I took them to a bench in an area near the yard called St. James. And I've watched that bench for years. It's a bench in a community. Every community has it. It's never a chair in good condition. It just appears on the street, kind of breaking down. Or sometimes it's a makeshift bench. You put 2 bricks and a block of wood, and guys assemble there, right? And people from the community assemble there. And I remember when I was a kid, my dad driving to work in the morning, I'm in the back of the car. There was a guy that used to balance on a wall. It's an art to balance on a wall, because the wall is about 6 inches wide, but he would lie down on that wall and look more comfortable than you look on your own couch at home. And of course, my dad, being a civil servant, would shake his head and say, idlers, And but as I got older and I sort of got an understanding of that guy, I realized he was actually a pan man. He played pan in Sweden for a certain time of the year. And then for the rest of the year, he would just lie down on that wall and chill. He would leave Sweden when it was winter. And so this kind of itinerancy and this kind of constantly moving, transgressing borders and criteria, I think is very important to experience. And very often, when you're in those kinds of uninhibited spaces, free spaces in the public domain, associating and sharing ideas, it means that you're not really in that space where you're kind of subject to the dictates of capital and industry. Singular and compressed forces. So this idling, it's very complicated because, of course, on a block, guys could be selling drugs, but other things could be going on. But I know that some of those spaces are very fertile spaces, and they're kind of informal zones of awareness and education. And I think in my growing up years, I moved between both spaces. I mean, my parents were quarreling with me, spending too much time on the street, too much time on the corner, and things like that. And then I went to school formally. But I think when I look at my life now, in hindsight, I learned from both worlds. And in fact, when I became an artist, as opposed to a civil servant like my parents, I realized that those skills were the ones that helped me to survive more than the other skills. But what I'm getting at is that in the notion of sustainability, there's a tremendous pressure to follow one model of, maybe professional grant writing, trying to forge these alliances with international agencies. In those relationships, they very rarely fund you to do what you want to do. They kind of fund you to do what they think you should do. And they have their own agendas of how you must all line up and work. So the problem is you kind of look like the idler when you kind of say, well, okay, it'd be nice to get that money, but will I ever get around to doing what I'm trying to do? If I go into this relationship. And then there's a kind of a almost Foucauldian discipline and punishment relationship you develop in institutions when you don't comply, right? So I don't know what it's like for Sharelly, because I think in the Dutch territories where they have these different relationships to Holland that are semi-autonomous, and in Holland there's still a kind of philanthropic engine in its relationship to its former or semi-colonies, while we just went through, coming through the British needle, they were glad to get rid of us. And even those of us that went to England to help build it, they're trying to get rid of them too. So it's a different kind of relationship to that kind of thing. And we don't, we don't really have that relationship to the US as well, in terms of funding, So we're very much on our own. And I think Trinidad as a society, because it's an oil economy, there are resources. The problem is they're very shrewd societies, where they came into existence for extraction and to make money. So the human imagination is seen as something a little too, shifty and drifting. As I said, you're kind of not subject to the forces of capital, So with Aliciad, we have basically tried to survive by forging relationships with our community of artists, people living, most of our support has come from our own personal resources and from people who just think what we're doing is interesting. Like, for example, 1 or 2 artists who've done projects with us have then supported other things we're doing. Like, for example, Ebony Patterson from Jamaica has, over the years, supported young Jamaican artists to come and work with us. After she came and worked with us at a very early stage of her career and had quite a successful project, and different relationships like that. So we do it through relationships informally rather than through institutional and structural things. And we are growing. I'm not saying this like an end all. I'm just saying we are learning. Yeah.
Sharelly, did you want to jump in on that?
Yeah. For me, if I think of this idea of sustainability, I would see it more as a possibility to evolve and a continuation. Because for us, it's what has been happening historically is that you see that there are many gaps, within generations, and so memory loss or things have been done before but have been forgotten. Infrastructures that have been put in place but have disappeared. So in terms of sustainability, there's just this opportunity of continuation and evolving as a primary starting point. I think that for me is very important, and that you start something and actually get to finish it, and not necessarily in having a fixed model, because that has never worked. I mean, if you look at the discos or even a restaurant or even businesses in the Caribbean, they pop up and then they go file for bankruptcy after a few years. They never really, there's only a many few, and even within years, if the family changes over, you see that the business suffers from it. So for me, in terms of looking at the possibilities, it's what Chris said. It's very difficult when you apply for funding because you are being told what the parameters where you have to plan your project, and you have to kind of present it in a particular way. They already know what they want from you, and the objective you have to adhere to. So it becomes very difficult. So what I did in terms of being able to create and do things with UniArte was say, okay, I'm not going to start from that. I'm not going to start with asking for funding. I cannot tell you what I'm doing. I'm going to start. I'm going to experiment. I'm going to feel. So the building was really the mere possibility of a collaboration with business owners. Please allow me to use your building. It started with myriad. How much money do I need for rent and water? That's it, right? And so build a portfolio, as in do projects, do experiments, and see. And we did that for like about two years. And in the 3rd year, I had enough feel of what worked, what is needed So when I go back to the funding and they will tell me, well, you have to do X, Y, and Z, and I'm telling, then I know I could stand very fitting in my ground and telling, yeah, but that doesn't work that way. And this is what I've done without money. I've done it for so many times, so many ways, and this is what I want to try out. So to kind of see on a balanced term, to kind of, and as opposed to just creating a project that would fit that mold. So that's for what the approach that I took, kind of stubborn. And what I'm noticing now is that, okay, so they would support, but they're also very curious to see if there is any development and seeing what's happening with the other colleagues or the other institutions, that they are also curious to seeing what's happening with us. What I now have to keep in mind and have to be very pay attention to is having a building, for instance. That is not something that for me maybe might be something to sustain for a lot of years, because if I look at Elvis, if I look at other institutions that do have that structure, has that been helpful? Or is it more helpful to create writers, right? To find people that like to write, to find people in the business that like to make budgets, to find curators that would look for alternative artists and teams to kind of explore, right? So right now for UniArte, it's very important to have a housing where one can experiment and can gather the knowledge and experience. Once having that, can move on and bring about other projects that would kind of initiate or shift and kind of shift the conversation or kind of activate people in a different way of doing things differently. So that means that I must remain open into having a complete different project and changing my structure, as opposed to making sure that I celebrate 10 years following the same model.
That's
so that's for what I have to.
That's really very interesting what you said there, because I remember over the years when I was developing a lot of projects, there's a kind of way people come to us and say, what's your program? Or can we get an example of your program in the past? And then what a lot of people never realized over the years is that we had no program. Our program was to be receptive and to be responsive and to remain flexible and dexterous, because a curator might call and say, I'm going to come to Trinidad to spend a week to do something. Another artist says, I want to come and develop something. And then one says 2 months. And then you say, what, 2 months? A whole 2 months? No, that's going to close down the space. But then you say, okay, how about 2 weeks? And then suddenly we allowed to accommodate the person who's coming for 1 week. And then we could call somebody, and then somebody says, you call on the phone and you find out somebody's been in the country doing research elsewhere. And you say, would you come and talk to a group of artists? We didn't know you were here. But we sometimes on a month by month basis, we never know what's out there, what's orbiting us, and how do we have a structure to be responsible. A big institution can't do that.
Right. That's very true. That's very true.
Can I say something?
Go ahead.
Because I've been buzzing with ideas just listening to. I mean, I know I've even seeing in the chat there's a strong opinion that there's a larger difference, but my mind can't come back to the fact that there's so many similarities to explore. Actually, I'm in the middle of Inglewood right now, and as you were talking, I was like, the first thing that came to mind was Nipsey Hussle for me, and how with art like my personal my I statement idea on like what this experience has been for me is that even when I'm dealing with people who have no context on our deities, our heroes, our people, this was somebody who was extremely important to this specific neighborhood, and people will walk up to our altar in the backyard and assume that he is Noah or that he is Basquiat. For the likes of them, they have no context on even what's happening for us today. And yet they've come with this idea of like, what is your program? How can we help? Where does our money go? But it's like, are we in that place that we need that much help that, there is no conversation for sustainability, our own heroes, our own people who are speaking life into our people, saying that you can totally do this. These are the economics, these are the plays. And that is something that we think about at the underground, where everything is low cost, no cost. We really aren't selling you a product. We aren't selling you identity of Blackness. There is no one dimension to this. We are pushing up against it. And, I haven't been to either one of your places, but yeah, I feel like I'm there because I'm doing it here. Like, that's why I feel like the similarities are definitely needed to speak to. I'm not the founder. I'm not the director. I don't have to touch so much conversation around funding per se, but I definitely think listening to both of you talk, like, to me, there's still this big thing that only strikes me for, the American context. Like, I think about, like, people often say, like, we're the West Coast version of the Studio Museum. And I see a lot of colleagues from there in this chat too. And I'm always inspired by how that institution has, I talk to my mentor about this a lot, has not tried to bother themselves with being the it place, but just created a channel, as you were saying, that creates the curators, creates the artists, puts them back into the world. And then I think about that again in the sense of, like, why do we have the space that is defined for us? Is this field recognizing us? Like, why must we still be sprinkled amongst, why can't we have a uniform conversation in some degree,
Mm-hmm.
That's my query, or like thinking as I listen to you guys talk,
The Caribbean is a space like that. I mean, it's there's so many.
Howard, so there's always been this voice of, like, widespread different voice of African or Blackness, but I still think that, like, as far as the context of today's conversation, like, there's still something very unsafe about our safe space,
Yeah.
Well, part of the legacy that we've all inherited, the hemispheric legacy of, the sort of the way our presence, what brought us here in the first place, and how we have to kind of sort of ask ourselves, I mean, most people know why they're here, but I think in terms of this hemisphere, most of us don't know how or why we're here on our own terms,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there are more recent migrants that may come to open shops or something, but the vast majority of people that find themselves in the Caribbean were brought here to work in labor camps, camps of Europe. And then with that foundation, we then have to create civil societies. That's a big task, and I think one of the things about the US is that the US, nobody remembers when the term Old World and New World changed to First World and Second World. The US is a post-colonial society at odds with itself. While I don't think we question that in the Caribbean, we understand that. That's kind of like the foundation of our reality.
And I think for me, that's a challenge to roll with you. I think that's the big challenge of, like, the outreach that I have to do is not merely just bringing people into the physical location. It's very enticing to be in a garden that's purple and just the aesthetic is beautiful, but the larger conversation leaves you feeling lost. I think this is why I think this idea of, like, the underground detitling haunts me so much, because it's just like, then jokingly in this neighborhood, it's like AJ's the Harry Tubman because he has all this work of trying to, be a lamp, be a light, be something bigger than, and we're just talking about art, as you were saying, like, the safe space isn't even, I always find I talk about art last when I'm in these tours or in this space, because there's just so much emotional unpacking that has to be done, whether it's just like letting people breathe. The yoga has become so important, especially as a Black man, because I've seen, again, as you were talking, I'm in the middle of Inglewood. We're talking like it's a really relevant conversation still, that people aren't waking up in the morning and the first thing they're not thinking about Matisse. They're not thinking about Matisse's relationship to anything, right? It's a food on the table. And so we must acknowledge and honor those things before we even get to start talking about
Right.
the text of art.
Right. And, the place does matter. It is, Weeksville, is beautiful as our campus is right across the street from New York City, housing projects and Kingsborough houses, and residents of Kingsborough were absolutely integral to saving the historic houses you know, in the late 60s, you know, so it's not an us and them. It's like, those are our people too, you know, and we have to act like that and get better at that, you know, because it is all one community, because, you know, we all Black when we walk out the door and everything, you know. I wanted to make sure we got a chance to address some questions that are coming up both in the Q&A and in the chat, because we're at 1:15. I hope everybody's good on time. Want to remind everybody that we're talking about location and space, and, you know, one of ADAMA's themes are everywhere we go, there we are, you know. Yeah, you know, just remember, this is kind of one of the driving sort of insights and animating ideas of ADAMA, as it, you know, to put Black people everywhere and to bring the diaspora together. One of the questions I'm seeing from Melissa Cobbler, she's like, Jamaican Vincentian here, wondering if the cultural hybridity existent in the Caribbean has allowed Caribbean artists to collaborate regardless of language, i.e. Patois, Creole, Dutch, Spanish, or cultural background, i.e. Afro, Indo, Chinese, Caribbean identity. So if the cultural hybridity has allowed you guys to kind of work together and collaborate regardless of language or specific cultural background.
I think it's fertile ground. I mean, one of the things that, especially for me, when I lived in the US in the 80s, I mean, multiculturalism was very disturbing. It was coming of age then. And what multiculturalism required is specificity. In other words, I can find an identity for you to give me money to operate on the side, and then you get more money to be normal over there. So, you know, what happens to you if you are Cuban, Black, and gay? Right? There's money to be Cuban, there's money to be gay, there's money to be, you know, so, but small money.
Right.
And that is always big money over there to be normal. So whatever normal was at the time.
Normal.
Yeah, so the funny thing about it is, in the Caribbean, there is no medicine to adjust to. The whole damn place, everybody is from somewhere else. Everybody is mixed up, you know, in some ways. There's so many myriad stories. Every time somebody does a DNA test, they find out something they never knew. But at the same time, apart from ethnicity and trade routes that brought us all there, I think linguistically as well, there have been some subdivisions, you know, between the Spanish, the French, the Dutch, and the English, and so on. But weirdly enough, when you look at the visual, and even with the music, you know, the boundaries start to break down. And then what I found recently, in one of the things that we were discussing in Puerto Rico, was that, for example, one of the members, founders of Beta Local, had never been to English space that was Creole. In other words, when they think English, they think of American hegemonic in relation to Spanish and their own sort of Creole forms. So when they came to Trinidad to spend time with us, suddenly they were in a Creole English space, so that there was a kind of a weird evocativeness to the language that matched something about the kind of Spanish that's spoken in Puerto Rico. So we were kind of looking at linguistic, you know, affinities that we had never thought of before, because it's not about formal Spanish and formal English. And there were some weird indiscretions, you know, where we were trying to trade the most sexist videos by rappers we could find, you know, because that's usually where the imagination is most fertile, you know. So there was all kinds of weird things we were up to, trying to figure out what the connections were. Anyway, so I don't know if Sharelly can jump into that, you know.
Yeah, for us to like being in the Curacao and that counts for at least the 3 of the 6 islands. is the fact that we're raised multilingual, so we speak 4 languages. That kind of allows you to interact very broadly. But even though you would expect, speaking Spanish, that there would be more interaction with the Spanish islands, or even the English-speaking islands, you see that still the mold of the thing that people aspire to look after is Europe or the United States. So that is so when you talk about collaboration or the engagement, it could be because there is a facility of the language that we do speak it. It should be definitely encouraged more. So that's one of the things that, at least for me, coming back, trying to go to Cuba to kind of experience the Biennale, how is it happening there, as opposed to going only to Europe to see what's happening there, or to go to London, to the States. Also being in and having the opportunity to travel. I've been to Trinidad, kind of understanding, okay, what is the context, the Caribbean context, and engage. So also Venezuela, having artists from different islands, talked with, came in contact with Jamaica, the NLS, Kingston, to having conversations to see what they're going through. So at least for me, I'm trying to do that. But sometimes it's not only the ability to have the means, because even if you have the means, or even if you have the possibilities of speaking the language, that doesn't mean that immediately it will happen. But I think it is very much possible. And the Caribbean is definitely a space where that can happen. And with that, I'm referring to the dialogue, because you have this thing. Last I was watching a video of the child of the earth, Juditera, the child of the earth. So meaning the people that were born and raised here. For us, they speak Papiamentu, right? Papiamentu and the other languages. So they can be from wherever, and descendants. And that would be there's interaction there, because you are from Curacao, or you're from Aruba, or you're from St. Martin. You were born, and that's your reality, no matter your background. So you have this commonality in terms of that. But as opposed to the collaboration and conversations from, let's say, Curacao, Trinidad, or Martinique for that matter, or Cuba, that should be enriched much more. That should be more. That definitely should be more. But that doesn't happen often because of the distance and how difficult it is to travel among each island, but also in terms of the large majority still looking at the US or the European as a way to be.
Mm-hmm. So, we're getting on 1:22. Are you guys good for time? If we wanted to go for another like 10, 15 minutes, you guys good?
Sure.
Okay. Participants, audience, you guys good to go for a few more minutes? Because I want to do 2 things. One, there's a particular question I wanted to ask AJ, and then 2, I wanted to give Chris and AJ a chance to show their decks, just so that folks could have a little bit of context. So I'm people are keeping
everyone's response to that question. It's a stream of yeses.
People are I just wanted to make sure. I don't want to assume nothing about anybody's time.
I'm now catching up with the technology. I'm now realizing that people,
because it's a very different landscape to not be able to see people.
I know.
Response back to you.
Right.
I'm realizing that people have been talking all along. I'm sort of I'm like granddad here.
Oh, stop. Hey, so, one of the things you touched on, AJ, was this idea of before you can even get to art, you got to kind of deal with context. Can you talk about that and the challenges and what you've learned from going through that process with people who come into the museum, particularly folks from the neighborhood and whatnot?
Yeah. I mean, and this is my 3rd institution in LA specifically. So I used to also work at the Broad, and I used to work at CAM, the African American Museum, not too far down the road from me. So my combined experience with the 3 all together. And just also just, you know, across the board, I've done things with LACMA and things like that, but just I in art and practice, I think across the board there's so much you know, even for me, like I love listening, but it takes for me like a lot to decompress and to really make it make sense for my lived experience, like what these larger concepts are, because everything that has been said today is super experienced by any person of color in any context. It's not art or fine art or whatever, artist, curator, all those different things. I think yeah, I mean, if you really want to engage the audiences, I've been able to be very blessed to see audiences' brains expand from I didn't even know where I was at to like, how do I support, right? So the connection to the money will always be there. We'll always provide, especially on our own context. I've had grandmothers with little to nothing to offer want to buy the shirt, the book, whatever keeps us going, keeps them connected to the story. And it was a very natural one because I center perspective on not going, you don't know who Picasso is, you've never heard of these things. It's like, how's your day? Have you eaten? What's new? Because I find so much of it is, even today, I'm gonna walk away from this conversation a way better, you know, voice in the arts because I've listened and I've learned to play what the cues are. What's, you know, what they always say, what's missing, paint what's not there, is kind of my theory on life. But yeah, I mean, I think so much of it is the narrative that I think this museum is definitely connected to me with is that I definitely think that Noah, I'm a fan. If you haven't explored him visually, he's a great painter, but his curation is on levels that have, you know, we haven't even touched. We've only ran through about 3 of his 18 shows. I mean, this man literally curated 18 shows essentially right before he died. And then we're running through those as an institution. And not a lot of people know that coming into the space, that this is, as I always call it, a will and testament idea for me, is that we are enacting a man's dream. So there's so much space that, like, we talk about physical space, but like the spiritual plane, right? Like it's Easter. I mean, this idea of like Noah is ever present, Blackness is ever present. There's nothing to escape from. There's nothing to run away from. There is no post, you know, we can go into that. This idea of post-Black, like it's super current. It's super here. It's never left. And I find that I don't have to talk to people about art history for days. I can literally listen to their lived Black experience and see that become art, you know?
Yeah, one of the things we, I think, talked about yesterday was this idea of making sure that, you know, around museums in general, particularly here in the United States, there is some kind of threshold anxiety for folks who don't regularly go to museums, because there has always been this idea that you needed to know something about what you're about to see before you can go in there, you know? And I think a lot of the work, you know, particularly for, you know, folks who serve non-artists, you know, just like regular everyday folks, is sort of the work I think you're talking to is about reassuring them that they're welcome here with whatever knowledge they have, you know, whether or not they know everything about, you know, whether or not they've been reading art news and know about this is a new hot painter, or if they know somebody, you know, as like a Kerry James Marshall or Wangechi Mutu or somebody like that, you know, it doesn't matter. You're welcome in these spaces. And I think that's the work that we end up doing, is just opening up folks to a comfort. And that's part of the safe space activity that we are engaged in, is bring whatever knowledge you have. If you have none, or if you have everything, you're still welcome here.
I've never worked for an institution that had an altar for Nipsey Hussle be created. You know, I've never ever seen anything like this. And I don't want that to be like dismissed or put under an undercurrent. I mean, that is a huge shift. This is, we're working with the needs of where we are today. Not a history lesson, not a few, you know, it's what's happening right now. And that's why I went back to that point earlier with this idea of like when they do enter this space, it's hard as a young person to see people dismiss that, you know, the fact that we are even present. And so that's why I think, you know, maybe speaking as like a younger voice on the panel, a lot of people feel frustrated with museum spaces, because it's like, why would I even enter a building that has no, like, it's not relevant. It does not see me. It does not intend to see me. And for the museum goer to come in here and to see someone that they drove over here listening to be respected and be centered in a traditional African landscape with where we're feeding him and where we're talking to him. His wife has been here. His family has been here. That shifts the entire thing. All of a sudden now they are that much more interested in listening to what I have to say about art, you know?
Right. Exactly.
I was thinking to, you know, like not to over romanticize, you know, like knowledge and different levels or different types of knowledge. But I mean, in my career, I mean, some of the most sort of the questions that I've received that have sort of pushed me to really think and ask myself about what, you know, the things I'm doing usually come from people who don't have a background in art because they're not distracted by the history of art. In the sense that they're not asking you, why are you doing this because of something that happened in another country in another time. They just want to know right now, like, why did you do this? Why is it important? And why should I pay attention to it? And that's sometimes it feels very true, but actually it's one of the best. If the question is asked with a kind of a curiosity, or it becomes very useful. It kind of grounds you in a way. And then sometimes there's the opposite when someone comes to you and says, this is what you are doing. And that one is the one that I find is really fascinating. You know, like, this is what you're doing. And I'm like, oh, and very often they're right. You know, they're right within the moment, if you know what I'm saying. And those are very rare experiences because very often the work is taken to locations where there's this kind of agreed or collective rationale that's prefigured for why this thing is here and why we should appreciate it, right? But in the art world, the art is, you know, that kind, you know, so that kind of questioning you're probably more prepared for because especially people who go to art school. So we've kind of done our backflips and we have our answers. But the other answers is, the other relation is very challenging and very informative and sometimes very motivating as well.
Yes.
Can I say, Rob, I think that a lot this idea of like the larger institutions doing that work, like going back to what is the alternative space versus like the larger space, you know, from my experience at other institutions, that I think through Basquiat as a very simple, very relatable entryway for so many of us into art, into fine art. Maybe I'm making a larger statement, but I think that I've seen, you know, institutions like merely just put it up on the wall and feel like they've done a job. And what people feel like when they're educating people, whether those people are Black or brown people or not, like the larger conversation is like, oftentimes it becomes a thing of like, let's talk about this artist's form and let's not even bring up his cultural context at all. And I think about that with Basquiat as like this, my favorite artist in the world. I'll argue that down because it's like, how do people feel they've moved on from him when you didn't even look at him in the right context? I think about what it means for him to be, you know, multilingual, multi-racial, what it means for him to be a financially successful artist post his appreciation for that, you know. And I think about
post his life.
Post is everything, you know, like he doesn't know he's on a Uniqlo shirt. He's on to some other plateau. And I think about why I feel like that's important, why I brought that up is just because, again, like if you erase so much of this, the race conversation or the cultural conversation, you know, my name's AJ, but Antoine Girard is the most like French inspired, you know, Negro name my mom could think through. And I think that like oftentimes it's like, yeah, I didn't see myself until I saw myself. And when I saw myself in him, no one could take that away from me. And no one ever told me, you know, the context was this, it was like a, you know, the slick Rick the ruler, like there's a warning, there's something here, there's something that we should be aware of. And so people are like, I've seen him before. It's like, well, they're young men and women in this world who can still benefit from that story contextually put into the grasp for them, you know. And so that's why
Right.
like why these spaces are so important is because if we're not giving them direction, that means that after they leave these four walls that they can still use them, then it's a waste of the time, you know.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. You know, that's the Basquiat has become like, you know, Jordan, you know,
Yeah.
LeBron, you know, and it's just like he's in some ways that's the extraction from and disentanglement, you know, that, you know, capitalism has worked on this Black artist and sort of remove them from their Blackness so that they're just Basquiat, you know.
I have that fear when it comes to institutions like the underground, you know. I have that fear when it comes to our spaces all the time. Like, what is the curiosity? Is it that they're just looking to be informed, or is there some type of ownership that they always seek to create when they come into our spaces? And that's what is so challenging on a day-to-day basis for me. You know, you want to be fair, because that was like Noah's particular vision was like art for everybody. But then in the current context, I mean, I'm young, but this is a story that's old as time. It's like we were always really open.
Right.
And you open to art, you look around and everything you love is gone. And so that's what's always a huge challenge, you know?
Right, right. Somebody has shared, Melissa Cobbler has shared an article, No Word for Art in Our Language, Old Questions, New Paradigms, article by Nancy Marie Mithlow. So that's something to check out. This is based on a comment that Fahamu, I think, made, and I'm just trying to find it. He's like, you know, there's no word for art in indigenous African language. Art as we know it is a European construct, but creative expression and creative practice is essential to African being because it is literally a form of praise and acknowledgement of spirit. Understanding this shifts how we might think about the presentation and dissemination of art. Go Fahamu.
No, I just wanted to say something about what AJ was talking about, as he talked about Basquiat, you know, because I think, yeah, it's really weird. You know, the first time I saw Basquiat's work, like live, wasn't in New York. I saw it, it was like maybe like in the mid 80s, like around 84, 85. There was a show, I think, at the Pompidou Center. They had a couple of pieces. And I remember my first encounter with I thought I was like looking at the wall of a parlor somewhere in the Caribbean, you know, like a shop wall somewhere in the Caribbean, you know, just in terms of spatial, the use of flatness and you know, and which brings up another question about why spaces like UniArt, Arte, or Avasiad, or NLS, and all these other spaces, because a lot of artists working in the diaspora, in metropolitan centers, so to speak, have very often to submit to or to negotiate with the dialogues of entry, how their work fits into the kind of, you know, dialectics of those environments. And it creates such an interesting shift when they bring that work back into the Caribbean. Because very often when that work goes the other way, it seems that the work becomes art or becomes something of relevance through its entry, but there's no sense of what it's, the DNA of its making and what all the dialogues. So in a way, it's always a smaller understanding of that work. You know, you think of artists like Ebony Patterson, Nicola Wai, or even someone like Ibrahim Mahama, you know, Ibrahim Mahama in Ghana. How is his work seen? How would it be seen, say, in Brazil, the Caribbean, as opposed to, you know, if some part of England or Europe, or it's and those questions never really often come up, you know. And some artists, I think, for a lot of Caribbean artists in the last couple of years, who have been working within places like, you know, in Canada, England, in the US, there's been a sudden increase of interest into how their work is understood from a Caribbean perspective. Because a few years ago, that wasn't even seen as something, if
Right.
you know.
Right. Right.
Um,
And
and it's
does that bring up the issue of the need? Earlier we were talking about ecosystems, and it seems you're raising this point about as a key part of the ecosystem is for, you know, writers, critics who are based in, grounded in those cultural contexts to be able to help explain and set, you know, some frameworks up, you know, because often it's the artist. You guys can sort of, you know, back me up on this. You guys are mostly about, you know, creating your work. You're working on these ideas, and quite often it's, you know, the artist doesn't always have time to sort of write about the cultural context they're coming out and sort of explain. And so where can we also support this sort of next generation of critics and thinkers and people who can, you know, provide the frameworks that can accompany these artists as they go out into the world?
yeah.
You
Well,
know?
you know, some of the people that we read about in traditional art historical textbooks never went more than 50 miles in any direction from where
Right.
they, you know.
Right.
I
Right.
think
Right.
in the
Right.
world we live in now, people have to be on the move. They have to kind of to even catch up or figure out what they're looking at. It's weird, you know. I mean, I
Mm-hmm.
was shocked. I was reading something about, I don't know, one of these guys like Baudelaire or somebody, you know, that like these foundational kind of old school, and you realize some of them, they never left or went more than a couple, you know.
And
Mm-hmm.
as a person who reads a lot of books, I find like I always feel like I'm just saying like the thing that's super obvious, but I feel like you know, I could read a old catalog from the Studio Museum or whatever, something like, as you said, like the foundational parts of what the art history, especially for us, look like, or I could go talk to my grandmother, or also just listen into elders and get the very same context without even ever bringing up any artists. And that's what's really, really, like I said, I never thought that the critical sort of like the curatorial roles, like all those things never looked available to me, because even I always think about my intersections. People, the first thing they do when they see me is ask me, what do I do? That's a common question for all of us, but literally, like, what's your production value to this? Like, are you making art? If you're not the artist, then why are you even involved? It seems like that's not a conversation, that the thinking doesn't seem like a route, you know?
Yeah, yeah. But I see, you know, some great sort of young, you know, curators out there who are providing value. There's some of them on here, you know, Neama is on here. You know, this conversation also had Larry Mensa, and I'm sure they're going to get Dexter Wembley. Fahamu's exhibit at Weeksville was curated by Natalia Mills, you know, a young sister who's now down in Atlanta. On the criticism front, you know, there are sites like Culture Type. Arts.Black is doing amazing work. So there's folks out there, you know, who are just really focused on that piece of it, not the production, but the thinking about what it means and putting it in context. Black art now, as somebody is saying. Yeah, there's folks out there who are doing it, and I think it's important to elevate those voices, because if we are trying to move this conversation to sort of create this global network, then one of the things we talked about yesterday was sort of the Afropunk model. You know, there were a bunch of artists that came out of that. There was, you know, a bunch of places that began to write about it, and you know, and it all kind of came together. There were venues for them to, the artists to have shows and whatnot. And so there are models in other areas that that can be followed. In the 90s, there was Trey Ellis's New Black Aesthetic that sort of pushed Black culture forward in a way that sort of broke with sort of the traditional sort of ways that people thought about things, and sort of ushered in and sort of really stuck its stake in the ground about the emergence at that point. You can remember them emerging, people like Spike Lee and, Nelson George and young Chris Rock, and, as part, and sort of position them as being part of a sort of vanguard. And I'm sure there are international, publications and organizations that are out there that are, again, providing that kind of context to be able to say, this is something that's happening, this thing in Black art, whatever it is. And we need to bring those up as well, even as we are supporting artists and the makers and the institutions that are trying to provide spaces, because it goes hand in hand with this key thing that I think we've all been talking about, is providing context for people who don't live this every day,
That's what I like about the moment that we just exchanged right now, where it's like, it takes two, right? It takes, I don't want to be ageist or make anybody feel like that, but it takes the situation to be comfortable for someone young enough to feel curiosity is okay.
Mm-hmm.
And then it takes someone who is responsible, who has, as they always say, if you know, teach, if you don't know, learn, to then do what you've just done and to point directions. And that's what, like I said, for me, my I statement was when I found Basquiat and then I got comfortable teaching him, then I felt curious enough to go out and find all of the names, the Bob Thompsons and the Sam Gillams and the Noah Davises and all the other artists that have maybe informed him, worked alongside, or just had nothing to do, but also reflected me. And we're just talking Black. So it's like, with this idea of like the canon, like there's so much of us that's still unexplored largely in that way. So I just want to call that out, because I know I have peers listening too. And oftentimes it's like, what's my entryway? How do I do this? It takes confidence from both. It takes both ends. It takes, that's what I always say, especially as I transition into being a little bit older, is that, oftentimes we see the youth, and I'm thinking through like Generation Z, my brother's ages and the mentees that I've had in my life in that type of way. If I just speak onto them about all this stuff, they have no interest. But if I give them space to then be curious, then I can meet them where their interests lie.
Right. 100%.
I wanted to jump in on this idea of confidence and that's a two-way street. And in a way, confidence as an artist as well is very important for you to feel comfortable to be able to create and be comfortable with presenting it outside of the context that you are in. To give a recent example, if it wasn't for support and kind of recommend the work that I made to kind of be seen in other spaces outside of my context, like that doesn't help. That doesn't give me an opportunity, basically. So it's also about the people that nominate you, recommend you, that support you, us, and that makes you as an artist stronger and makes you want to continue and presenting in spaces. For instance, the most recent is the Volkskrant, like it's a prize contest that was in the Netherlands. And if it wasn't for my nomination from Vincent, I wouldn't be in such a space presenting the work that I presented in a language that people don't understand. And the reactions were that was very important for me to have this understanding that people just want to experience. It's a language that's beyond, race and context. People can relate to your work beyond. And the interesting thing is when that happens, then all of a sudden you see a shift from home, right? Because then when you're outside, people see that there is interest. All of a sudden, back home, there's like a type of curiosity or a particular focus, that is also important. But what I mean to say is that even for you within the organization as an artist as well, the opportunities that are being and having the confidence to keep creating and pushing yourself and expose the work outside of the context is really important. But it's only in this collaborative force of having indie creators, writers that are willing to step outside and travel and look beyond their street, will kind of make shifts happen. The same thing, we're talking about diaspora. I think for me, it's very interesting to see what happens when we have people from the Caribbean that live in Europe. And of course, they are dealing with the dynamics of Europe, right? Of claiming the space there, which could be similar to the States, but they're busy with that particular context. But as opposed to how is the dialogue or how are they positioning themselves with the Caribbean, you know, and the ones that are still based in here. And those dialogues those are also tensions that we need to talk about, because everybody is kind of hustling and trying to create space for themselves. But so platforms like these are very important, but confidence, I think, in all the disciplines and in all the key parties are very essential, and pushing each other and creating space in opportunities wise.
Yeah, 100%, 100%.
I think
go ahead, Chris.
No, I think what she's saying is linked to, I think, what AJ is saying, you know, and it's a really interesting compression of some of the ideas, you know, because when you talked about Rob Thompson, I remember when I saw his show at the Whitney a million years ago. Like, I walked in and suddenly I thought, shit, Basquiat, the earlier work of Kerry James Marshall, you know, like they just suddenly all started talking to each other. While in that time, a million years ago, he was only being spoken about in the context of his relationship to Warhol. You know? So there's a kind of funny way in which, as time goes by, the picture unravels. Linked to that, I think sometimes looking at Caribbean or work of artists who come from a Caribbean heritage or experience, sometimes it's not about looking at a stylization in the kind of old-fashioned art historical way. It's more about looking at a kind of a critical gaze about what people notice coming from a particular society. So you could have an artist as quirky as Stanley Brown being sort of very similar in their strategies to somebody working in another, like in the US, you know, worrying around issues of visibility, presence, and things like that. So, and about Eurasia. So I think, and then you can speculate, you know, what would it be like for somebody like Stanley Brown to arrive in Holland in the 50s or early 60s to study art from a place like Suriname? Like, how does that impact on this presence and invisibility and so on? So interesting questions come up, you know.
Hey, I was just going to say too that, you know, as we talked about, and this more for the folks on who are in attendance, we talked about the context of writers and academics, but definitely want to shout out and encourage folks who have this kind of cultural, you know, understanding and rootedness in communities. You know, if your path takes you into being in museums, in mainstream museums, we need your advocacy there too as well. You know, just again, ADAMA's thing is everywhere we go, there we are. We need to be everywhere so that, you know, we can advocate for each other and contextualize work that comes in. And that's another aspect to growing, you know, these careers, to making sure that the next Sharelly gets like a shout out and gets put onto a panel and whatnot, and gets into a competition. And that's really about this community thing that we were talking about. We have like literally 7 minutes left, and thank you guys for hanging out. I didn't want to forget, Chris, if you want to like show some slides of Alice Yard, this would be really great if you want to do that.
I think if you just go on the site, our blog site, and you
All
can
right. All right.
So
All right.
what I did basically, I'll say what I did. I just simply did a couple of screenshots of different moments on the blog site. But it's quite easy to just scroll through and see what interests, because I mean, we've done so much over the last 10 years.
Absolutely.
This is our 13th year. So, and with no budget, back to the earlier conversation, no program and no budget, right?
Right.
Allegedly.
That's the way. That's the way.
Yeah. So it's very encouraging, you know, when I see Sharelly and others embark on this adventure. You know, yeah, I mean, there's some interesting, I don't know if we answered all the questions that I see hovering.
Yeah, there's one more that came in. I'll just read this one out real quick. Taisha Carrington, you guys speak of alternative spaces, often connecting with persons who aren't particularly artists but can relate to the work being done. I find this is the general demographic of people who follow contemporary art in Barbados. Do you find this actually limits access to being funded, as degrees and higher education, et cetera, bring value to our cause?
I don't know. It's a tricky question.
It's a tricky one. It's a tricky one.
My connection was fell out. Trying to search for the.
It's
question.
the last question in the Q&A.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Let me read it.
I don't think it's a guarantee, is what I'm saying.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Gotcha.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, Bob Marley doesn't have a degree as far as I know. Yeah. So, you know, it's kind of a tricky thing. He didn't go to music school. He didn't, you know, I don't even know if he so I mean, in throughout our cultural history, there are many levels, many different ways that people can operate, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Again, I want to thank everyone for being here as part of the panelists, Chris, AJ, Sharelly. This has been a really great discussion. I want to thank ADAMA for convening, because, hey, that's another function that museums, Black museums do, is we convene, we hold space for people for these kind of conversations. I want to thank Fahamu and his team there. Also wanted to give a shout out. There was supposed to be one other artist who was joining us from Kinshasa, Vishwa Bando, who had some technical issues, who could not join us here, but hopefully you guys will check out his work, and hopefully Fahamu and the ADAMA team will be able to get him on another conversation. But this has been great. Watching the chat has been great. Some of y'all are really funny. So this has been a great community conversation, and I want to thank you all again, panelists and participants, for spending these last couple hours on a Sunday afternoon. So thank you all. Have a great rest of your day. If y'all are celebrating Easter or whatever, you know, please have a great one. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Everyone, thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you. It was a pleasure.
All right. Y'all, let's not be strangers. Be in touch, all right?